The Harit Dharma Sutra mentions that women can be of two types, Sadyovadhus or Brahmavadinis. I came across a ritual in the Brihadaranyaka Upanishad, and the ritual was a ritual for obtaining a learned daughter. So not even any daughter, but a very well-educated learned daughter. In the Rig Veda, there is something called the Anukramani. The Anukramani is a list of the names of individual composers of Rig Vedic hymns, and in this list there are more than 20 women. The Theri Gatha, which was written in the Buddha's lifetime around 600 BC, is actually the earliest known collection composed solely of women's writing. In ancient times, society was extremely supportive towards women victims of gender violence, and there was absolutely no victim shaming or victim blaming, and in fact the blame was placed solely on the perpetrator.
Namaste. Welcome to another episode of Sangam Talks. And today we have with us Dr. Brishti Guha, Professor of Economics at the Jawaharlal University. And the topic which we are going to discuss today is on women in ancient India. We all know that since the ancient times, women in India have been at par with capabilities of men, both from the perspective of education, be it military strategies, be it as rulers, etc., etc. But there are some stereotypes that has been dumped onto us since the British times, that women were not equal in India and there was no women equity and so on so. But over the last few decades, a lot of information from the Itihasas, from the Vedas, Upanishads, they all show us that women have been at par with men in terms of all tops of excellence. So today we'll be diving deep into this topic of women in ancient India, and let us try to explore case studies, examples and philosophies that were common in those days and what went wrong in between and why we are being put in a position of stereotypes like this. So Dr. Brishti, welcome to Sangam Talks again.
Thank you so much.
Yeah. So Dr. Brishti, what made you propose to Sangam Talks about a topic like this?
Okay, because I'm very interested in these topics and I have come across a lot of literature in the course of my research on ancient India, which suggests that the stereotypes that we have about the position of women were not justified.
So we have characters like Atreya and Vasanthi, and we have them being portrayed as great women. So what do these characters show about attitude towards women in ancient India?
Okay, so Atreya and Vasanthi are actually two incidental characters in an 8th century Sanskrit play by Bhavabhuti, and the name of the play is Uttar Ramacharitam. So what happens here is that the two of them meet by chance when Atreya is traveling on foot to South India. And she tells Vasanthi that I am traveling in search of a better education. So Vasanthi says, oh, where were you studying before? And Atreya says, in Maharshi Valmiki's ashram. So Vasanthi is very surprised. She says, then that's the best place to study. Why are you even leaving? And Atreya says, that's normally true, but now Maharshi Valmiki is very busy because he's been composing the Ramayana, and whatever spare time he has, he spends with love and kush. So he doesn't actually have time to teach the rest of us anything new, and that's why I am leaving. Okay, and she's hoping that she can go to some Gurukul in the south, for example, one run by Agastya. And Vasanthi also says this makes complete sense. So what this tells us is that women in those ancient times were very serious about their education, because remember, this is not like simply transferring universities. She has to walk hundreds of miles on foot through thick forests, and she may be attacked by wild animals, she may be attacked by robbers, she can fall ill, and she is going alone. So she obviously thinks that the potential rewards are worth the risks. And Vasanthi also agrees. Now, one objection we may raise to this is that, this might be the case in fiction, but how do we know that it reflected the real attitude in society? So here I would say that because this is a play, a playwright cannot put anything into his play which will be unacceptable to the theatre going audience, because the whole success of the play depends on the audience being receptive to it. So Bhavabhuti must have thought that this will be understood and accepted by the 8th century audience.
Okay, well, that's interesting. So when we say women were powerful and at par with men in those days, so definitely they must have been educated, at par with them also. And those days we had this Gurukul system, we had mutts, ashrams, which gave education, at multiple aspects. So when it comes to education for women in ancient India, what are the important things which we keep in mind or comes to us as a part of the history?
Okay, so you are absolutely right. Gurukuls were there and they provided education to both girls and boys. In fact, in another play written by Bhavabhuti called Malati Madhava, there is a Buddhist nun named Kamandaki, and it turns out that she is a friend of the fathers of both the male protagonist and the female protagonist. The reason they are friends is because they all studied together in the same Gurukul. Now, by the way, this is in sharp contrast with the situation in other ancient societies like Greece or Rome, because over there schools which were called gymnasiums in Greece were only open to boys. Girls did not receive any formal education, and the most that a girl could hope for is that if her mother could read, then she might also learn to read, but nothing beyond that.
Okay. So it's on record that the gymnasium which we have in the modern perspective, those were in those days they were the education centers.
Yes, exactly.
So and these days it's a bodybuilding place where men go mostly.
Yeah.
Else it's usually meant for women. So but it's on record that in Greece those days gymnasiums or the school of learnings were meant for men.
Exactly.
Okay. So how did the concept of the Brahmavadini redefine the roles of women that they could play in spiritual and in intellectual life?
Okay, so the Harit Dharma Sutra mentions that women can be of two types, Sadyovadhus or Brahmavadinis. So Sadyovadhus...
Could you throw some light on Brahmavadinis and...
Yes, exactly. So Sadyovadhus were women who received some basic education and then they got married. So their primary purpose was to go in for a full-scale domestic life, but they still did receive some education. And Brahmavadinis were women who devoted themselves to a life of study and research.
Okay.
And before that, they had to go through some special ceremonies. For example, the Upanayanam, which is the sacred thread ceremony, and the Agnihotra, which is a fire ceremony. So after that, they engaged in scholarly activities, so they traveled freely to debates and conferences, and they usually supported themselves through teaching.
Okay.
And some of them, many of them were unmarried, some of them did get married, and those continued their scholarly activities even after marriage.
Okay. So that's interesting, because there are certain aspects that come really new to us.
Mm-hmm.
So we have the characters of Sulabha and Ubhay Bharti. So can we say that their characters or their position in ancient India, it reflected the intellectual capacity of women?
Definitely. So let me actually talk about some famous Brahmavadinis. So I'll start off with Gargi, because Gargi is known to some of us, and she's most famous for in the Brihadaranyaka Upanishad, and she's most famous there for her debate with Yajnavalkya. So what happens here is that King Janaka calls a conference. Now, King Janaka, by the way, Janaka was the family name of all the kings of Mithila. So it doesn't refer to, any specific King Janak. So he calls a conference and he announces that the first prize at this conference will be 1000 cows, and that's not all. Those cows will have their horns tipped with gold. So Yajnavalkya goes to that conference with some students, and then he tells the students, hey, take away all those cows. And 8 or 9 other people have come there to debate against Yajnavalkya, and they say, hang on, you have not won this debate as yet. And then they all start one by one trying to debate against him, but they don't have much luck. Then Gargi starts a one-on-one debate with him. So she asks him very complex and difficult questions until Yajnavalkya is finding it difficult to answer. So then Yajnavalkya says, Gargi, don't ask any more questions. Don't try to know the unknowable. If you do, your head will be cut off. Okay, so now some people have interpreted this remark as a sexist threat because they say, oh, because Gargi was a woman and she was daring to challenge Yajnavalkya, that's why he made such a threat. Now, I will disagree with that interpretation because if you go through the Upanishads, there are many debates, many of them are between men, and they regularly make such threats to other men. So basically, whenever they think that their opponent is likely to win, then they make such a threat just to get the opponent to back down.
Okay.
Yeah, so I would say that yes, Yajnavalkya was threatening Gargi definitely, but it was not a sexist threat. So Gargi is also very wise and she realizes it's time to back off. So she does that very gracefully and she even praises Yajnavalkya. And I think it had a good effect because we do hear of them co-authoring texts on yoga later on. Okay, so one thing I'd like you to note here, which is that Gargi being unmarried and traveling so far, she had to travel to Mithila for the conference. That did not seem to disturb anybody. On the contrary, she was given a lot of respect. Now we can contrast this with the position of women in Europe even as far back as the late 19th century. So here I'd like to mention a Russian mathematician named Sofia Kovalevskaya. So Sofia was born in 1850. So we are talking later half of the 19th century. And she had an issue that she wanted to attend maths conferences.
Okay.
But the problem is that she was unmarried. And in Europe at that time, it was completely unacceptable for a single woman to travel around freely. So, in fact, Sophia had such a problem that she went into a fake marriage just so that she could attend conferences. So, she got married, but it was a marriage on paper. So, now we can see that in ancient India, several millennia before Sophia, the situation was very different. Now, let's come to Sulabha. So Sulabha is another very famous philosopher and teacher. She is mentioned in the Mahabharata in book 12 of the Mahabharata. And so she was also unmarried. So she was traveling all over India and she heard some people saying that the current king Janaka, whose name was Dharmadhvaja Janaka, they said he is the foremost philosopher. And then Sulabha said, okay, then I should actually go and challenge this king to a debate, to a public debate. So she goes to Mithila and the king is sitting in court with all his courtiers and she challenges him and they start debating right there in front of everybody. And Sulabha puts forth her arguments and the king is unable to say anything. So Sulabha wins the debate. Okay, then you mentioned, okay, so one other tidbit about Gargi and Sulabha is that they are actually mentioned in a list of very highly respected teachers, which is found in the Ashwalayan Grihya Sutra. Okay, so in the Ashwalayan Grihya Sutra, there is a ritual which somebody who wants to start a course of self-study must go through. So sometimes people wanted to study a subject by themselves. So the Grihya Sutra said, okay, you can do that, but you need to first invoke the blessings of teachers who are very highly respected. So there is a list. And it has names of several women. So apart from Gargi and Sulabha, I think they have Maitri and Vadava Pratithi. So this shows how high esteem some women teachers were held.
Okay.
Yeah, and as I mentioned earlier, some of the famous Brahmavadinis were also married. So one example is Maitri, who was actually one of Yajnavalkya's two wives. And Yajnavalkya at one point, so his other wife was named Katyayani. So at one point Yajnavalkya decided that I have earned enough money. Okay, so he had probably taken away a lot of gold from lot of conferences, and he said, okay, fine, I am now going to go for Vanprasth. So he calls his wives and he says, I'm going to retire from householder life, and before I do that, I want to divide my wealth between the two of you. And Maitreyi asks, if I become very wealthy, will I become immortal? And Yajnavalkya says, no, you'll just become wealthy. Okay, you won't become immortal. So then Maitreyi says this very famous line, Yenaham namrita syam, tenaham kim kuryam, which means, what should I do with something which is not making me immortal? And then she and Yajnavalkya, they engage in a very famous dialogue on things like immortality, the soul, and even the nature of love. And this dialogue is an integral part of chapters 2 and 4 of the Brihadaranyaka Upanishad. Okay, then somebody we know even less about is Ubhay Bharti. So Ubhay Bharti actually was a contemporary of Adi Shankaracharya, and our source for knowledge about her is a biography of Shankaracharya called the Shankara Digvijaya, which was written by Madhavacharya. Okay, so Ubhay Bharti was a child prodigy. From a very young age, she knew all of the Vedas, she knew about the Darshan Shastras. People used to approach her whenever they wanted some problem to be solved. Okay, and at some point she gets married to another philosopher named Mandan Misra, and he belonged to the Mimamsa school of philosophy. So what happened is, sometime after this, Adi Shankaracharya also came up with the Advaita school of philosophy. But his issue was he wanted to make it more popular across India. So he thought that I can make it popular if I manage to defeat other philosophers from other schools of thought. So then he goes to Mahishmati, which is the city where Mandan Misra and Ubhay Bharti are staying. And then he asks people, how do I find the house of Mandan Misra and Ubhay Bharti? So people say, okay, you know, you go along and you'll find a house where there are pet parrots outside the house. But those parrots are talking about very weird topics. So Shankara says, okay, what kind of topics are these parrots talking about? And people said, you know, they are talking about things like, are the Vedas Swatah Pramanam or Paratah Pramanam? They are discussing the doctrine of karma. They are asking if we get the fruits of action, is God giving them to us or is fate giving them to us? Okay, so Shankara follows these directions and he finds the house and he goes in and he challenges Mandan Misra to a debate. And two other scholars are present there, Jaimini and Badarayan. So what they say is that if the two of you are debating, Ubhay Bharti needs to be the judge. And they give a reason for this. So they say she is very wise and very impartial. So because she is wise, she'll be able to evaluate the arguments on both sides. And because she is impartial, she'll make a fair judgment, even though actually one of the contestants was her own husband. So then there's a full account of the debate in the book, and it takes place over 17 or 18 days. and Ubhay Bharati is listening to both people.
She's the mediator. She was judge. In fact.
She was the judge, and she had to evaluate how good or bad their arguments are. So, after a point, Ubhay Bharati realizes that Mandan is losing the debate. So then she steps in and she tells Shankaracharya that I am Mandan's Ardhangini, so by that right, I can actually debate on his behalf. And then she steps into the debate and she asks Shankara very difficult questions which leave him in some kind of problem.
Okay. So, you spoke about a married woman who is debating, who was also a judge between a debate involving two big stalwarts.
Exactly.
And who, over the years, recourse the journey of the entire subcontinent. But we live in a world today wherein stereotypes like married women will not be in a position to pursue intellectual activity. Married women are expected to take care of the homes. So at this point of time, taking examples from scholars, great scholars like Ubhay Bharati, what are the lessons we learn from the ancient India's intellectual discourse? And how is it that married women can continue their scholarly pursuits and take forward intellectual activities? What are your thoughts about this?
Okay, so that's a very good question. And so I will mention one thing, that even back in those times, if women wanted to get married and also continue their scholarly activities, they had to work extra hard. So I mentioned that debate took place over 17 or 18 days. Ubhay Bharati was there and she was judging the debate. At the same time, she was also cooking. Okay, so she had to work extra hard, just like women today who choose both marriage and career have to do the same thing. But I'll also mention a couple of things. First is that it's very important to have the freedom to, either choose whether to get married or not. And if you get married, then choose somebody who also is into scholarly activities, because I mentioned two examples, Maitreyi and Ubhay Bharati. So Maitreyi was married to Yajnavalkya, who was a noted philosopher. So he appreciated the fact that she is also into philosophy. And in Ubhay Bharati's case, the situation was even more telling, because it's actually Mandan Misra who wanted to marry her, and just because he had heard of her wisdom. So it's actually her engagement in scholarly activities which interested him. So he was not looking for a conventional wife, right? So somebody like that would have been a more suitable match for her than, somebody who said, okay, you just have to adapt and you have to engage in domestic duties. And in fact, when Mandan Misra's proposal comes, Ubhay Bharati's mother has a talk with him, and she says that, remember that till now she's just learned how to study and she's just been studying. So, if your mother expects that she'll be able to do all the chores, she won't be able to do anything, right? So if she has to do them, your mother has to teach her everything, and you must be there to mediate between her mother and you. So these are some things that. And the other thing was, I mentioned there were ones who were unmarried, so there was never any pressure on them. So they also said that we are not finding anyone we consider suitable. So I think if you talk about application to current times, I would say there should first of all be no pressure, and secondly, if somebody still wants to get married, she should probably choose someone else who actually appreciates her for those very qualities.
Yeah. I totally agree with you. And I have one comparative question of similar kind in my mind. The thing is that not much passed, but in India, having a woman or having a girl child was seen as maybe a burden, or maybe it's not easy to take care of a woman child, to make her progress in life. So maybe because of other vagaries of life, it seems women child was seen as a burden. But based on what you said about the status of women in ancient India, we see that, or we understand that no, people yearned for a girl child who is intellectually strong, intellectually vibrant. And in India, we have a tradition of yagyas, rituals, or asking the Almighty, asking the God for what we wish. So there are also instances of yagyas happening for women or girl to be born in one's family. So what do you think that's supposed to happen? That the family or the parents already yearned for a girl child in their lifetime, that is to be expected to be happened in future. So what do you think about this? How strong was the intention to have a girl child in ancient India, and why is it that we have shifted from there to now, wherein having a girl child is sometimes seen as a burden?
Yeah, so we have the stereotype that there was very strong son preference. So, but I, completely got over this stereotype when I came across a ritual in the Brihadaranyaka Upanishad, and the ritual was a ritual for obtaining a learned daughter. So, not even any daughter, but a very well-educated, learned daughter. So this means the fact that there was a ritual there means that parents actually prized having learned daughters. Otherwise, there would be no need for such a ritual. So they not only wanted daughters, but you could probably say, okay, maybe if someone wanted a daughter, they might ask that the daughter should be pretty so that we can marry her off easily. But no, they actually wanted the daughter to be learned. So yeah, and then if we delve a little deeper, we also find a lot of other textual evidence. For example, there is a text called the Vriddha Garga Jyotisha, which was written by an archaic astronomer named Vriddha Garga and his descendants. And that has a passage which says, Kritika Nakshatre Kanya Upanayanam Kuryat, which means get your daughter's Upanayan done during the Kritika Nakshatra. Now this might also surprise us today because now the Upanayan is not done for girls at all, and even among boys there are only a few boys who get it done. But this text indicates that there was actually a time when getting Upanayan done for girls was normal. And plus, there are accounts of other parents in texts who really wanted educated daughters. So one example is there in the Mahabharata. So in book 9, they mention a sage named Kuni Garga. So what Kuni Garga does is he performs severe penance, and the only purpose of that is he wants a learned daughter.
Okay.
And he eventually gets one. So he has a daughter, she becomes very learned, and then Kuni Garga is so happy, he just looks at her and he says, she is perfect and my heart is filled with joy. I feel that I don't need anything more in this life, and I can leave my earthly body and I can ascend to heaven. And after that, we also know that his daughter also lived a very fulfilling life of study and penance. So
that's really amazing to see that parents or the father or the mother, they went on a penance, which means sadhana, to have a girl child that is excellent in knowledge or excellent in other aspects of intellectual activity. That's really a big message which you're sending about. But where did we go wrong?
Yeah. So, I mean, I don't, so I would say that for a long time, the situation was like this. But then we started experiencing a number of foreign invasions. Yeah. So that might have had something to do with that, because then we had to become concerned about women's security from the invaders. And whenever a culture as a whole is under threat, people in that culture, or many people, become more conservative. So that's what slowly happened to the position of women. And then for a very long time, they were living in a very different way, to the point where they forgot that things had been different earlier.
Yeah. In fact, foreign invasions indeed, they caused trouble not only for the social fabric, but also to the trade, to the political ecosystem, to the education system that existed. In fact, I would believe that the worst of what hit the education in India was the British mentality, wherein they brought the minutes on education, Macaulay's minutes on education, and they had really changed what foreign invasions could not do for over like 800, 900 years. The British were successful in doing it in a couple of decades. We have evidence for that. So coming back to the topic, I mean, in any society, the role of an intellectual community is very important. And of course, in that sense, scientists, writers, they're very important. So, who are the writers who were women in ancient India? Do we have knowledge about them? What made them take up writing as intellectual activity, apart from debating, apart from learning, apart from research, scientific activities? So let's talk about the writers of ancient India.
Okay, so this starts way back from the Rig Veda itself, because in the Rig Veda there is something called the Anukramani. The Anukramani is a list of the names of individual composers of Rig Vedic hymns. And in this list, there are more than 20 women. And the same list is replicated in a later text called the Brihad Devata. So this shows us that not only were women literate, but they were very accomplished poets, because your poetry needed to be of very high quality for it to be included in the Rig Veda. Okay, now this actually some Western Indologists found it really hard to accept. For example, Michael Witzel. Okay, and he may have been influenced by the fact that the situation was so different in ancient Greece and ancient Rome. So I have already mentioned that girls there did not go to school, but it was worse than that, because the intellectuals there had very negative views about the intellectual capacities of women. For example, Aristotle said that women don't even have a soul. And there is a famous book called The Dialogues of Plato, and this book is basically about discussions which Socrates had with some of his other philosophers. And there is a dialogue there which is on the nature of love. And there what people say is that there can't be any true love between a man and a woman. And they give this reason that true love always requires intellectual companionship and intellectual exchange. So they said, but how can a woman ever provide any sort of intellectual companionship? So you see, that was the thought about them over there. So it was very difficult for Witzel to accept that in ancient India, women are actually contributing to our most sacred text. Okay, so he even said that I think these must have been men pretending to be women. Now, not only is there no evidence for that, but we find it pretty ridiculous, because if a man is lucky enough and talented enough that his hymn gets accepted in the Rig Veda, naturally he will want fame for it. He will want it to be published under his own name.
Yeah.
No, why will he pretend to be a woman? Okay, and this tradition of women writing continued into post-Vedic times. For example, the Theri Gatha, which was written in the Buddha's lifetime around 600 BC, is actually the earliest known collection composed solely of women's writing. Okay, so the Rig Veda has some writing by women, the Theri Gatha only has writing by women. And these women were from a variety of backgrounds. For example, the contributors include a mother whose child has died. They include an ex-prostitute. They include a wealthy heiress who has given up her life of pleasure, and even the Buddha's own stepmother was one of the contributors. So what this shows us is that women from many backgrounds and including ordinary families could not only read, but they could also compose poetry. Okay, and this tradition of women writers kept continuing. So, for example, PAL 2010 is a journal article which lists about 40 women poets who were writing mostly in Sanskrit. And their poems can be found in a number of anthologies. So they include people like Shila Bhattarika and Vijja. And there were even women who composed entire Mahakavyas. So one example is Ganga Devi. Ganga Devi was a 14th century poetess who wrote a Mahakavya called the Madhura Vijayam. Now Ganga Devi was also the daughter-in-law of a Vijayanagar king, and her Kavya, Mahakavya is actually based on a on a real life incident which was happening at the same time as she was writing about it. So she's writing about a campaign which her husband Prince Kampan undertakes against Madurai.
Yeah.
Okay, so Madurai is called Madhura. And the reason they undertook this campaign is because Madurai for the past 40 or 50 years had been under the rule of the Madurai Sultanate, which was an offshoot of the Delhi Sultanate. And Vijayanagar said, we want to liberate Madurai from the clutch of this Sultanate. And they're also successful. So the Kavya is about that, and it's of very high poetic quality.
Yeah, that's wonderful. Ma'am, you quoted so many literary sources that that excellently portrays the role of women in ancient India in the perspective of academics, research, debate, writing, poetry, etc., etc. Do we also have archaeological evidence to showcase the same?
Yes, so actually our archaeological evidence goes back all the way to the IVC, to the Indus Valley Civilization. So when we think of the Indus Valley Civilization, we sometimes think that we find writing only on seals. But that's not the case. We also find writing on bangles. Okay, so these are ornaments worn by women. And the fact that they are buying bangles with writing on them shows that they could read. So female literacy was very much present. Otherwise, if you can't read, it doesn't make sense to buy a bangle with writing on it. Now, in fact, I've also looked at the field reports on the excavation of Mohenjo-daro, and there's an archaeologist named Ute Franke, and she talks in detail about stoneware bangles which had Indus script written on them. And she says that they were actually made through a very labor-intensive process, for which the craftsmen needed a special tool just for this. And then they had to inscribe the writing first, then they needed to fire the bangles. So she herself mentions that it would only make sense if there was mass demand for the bangles, if there was high demand. Okay, so this shows that it wasn't just one woman or two women who were literate and who wanted to buy these bangles, but lots of women were in that situation. And I would also like to mention that I'm not aware of any other ancient civilization during the time of the IVC or even much afterwards where women bought anything like this. Like they just bought ornaments, but the ornaments never had writing on them.
So the time goes back to Indus Valley civilization. Though literary sources we have access to in today's time, they came later, but through archaeological evidencing, we even go back to the Indus Valley civilization, the Harappan civilization, wherein women were empowered. They lived a life equal to men, and they had a role in trade, they had a role in craft making, they had a role in economy, they had a role in content creation or knowledge creation, etc., etc. That's a very wonderful thing to know. When we read the Rig Veda, we find that we take a very empathetic view on women who were victims of harassment, sexual harassment, etc. Where do we stand that when it comes to today's period, wherein crimes against women are frequently whitewashed or they are hushed up? Where do we stand then and where do we stand now?
Okay, so there's actually a lot of evidence that in ancient times, society was extremely supportive towards women victims of gender violence. and there was absolutely no victim shaming or victim blaming, and in fact the blame was placed solely on the perpetrator. So you mentioned the Rig Veda. In the Rig Veda, there's a rape mentioned, which was the rape of Usha, who was the dawn goddess. So you can also check the Jameson and Brereton translation of the Rig Veda, where they discuss this. And so what happens is that Usha feels very humiliated after the incident, and she runs away and she hides herself in a cave. But luckily her friends are following her. And now who are these friends? So these friends were two groups of rishis called the Navagvas and the Dashagvas, and they were musician rishis. So their job was that they came up with songs, they came up with chants, and they played musical instruments. So they follow her to the cave and they stand outside the cave and they're just trying to think, how do we make Usha feel better? So then they decide to do this by composing hymns, and they start to sing and they start to chant, and all of their songs are in praise of Usha. So they are praising her beauty, her radiance and her luster, and finally, eventually her morale lifts up and she feels happy enough, she feels confident enough that she can come out of the cave and she is ready to face society. So she is never stigmatized, nobody tries to blame her. In fact, her perpetrator is the one who is punished because an arrow is shot at him. So I would contrast this a lot with some women in current times experiencing shaming or being blamed. So in olden times, there seems to have been no propensity to do that. So nobody asked what was she wearing and why was she going around alone. So no one even raised those questions. And we can also see this in a couple of other examples. For example, the Puranas, including the Shiv Puran, they mention a rape in which the perpetrator's name is Brihaspati. Now this Brihaspati was different from Devguru Brihaspati, because you can refer to the work of Pajita, who was a British scholar who lived in India, and he has done a lot of work linking, comparing the different Purans and making sense of the genealogies of kings as well as rishis.
Okay.
So he has this book called Ancient Indian Historical Tradition.
Okay.
So what he says is that Devguru Brihaspati was linked to myth, but this Brihaspati was a real person. Okay, this other Brihaspati, and he belonged to a family of priests who served the king of Vaishali. So anyway, Brihaspati raped his sister-in-law, whose name was Mamata, and this was his younger brother's wife. And then as a result, a child was born whose name was Bharadwaj. And Brihaspati also said that I won't take care of this child. So now what happened is, again, Mamata was never abandoned by anybody, neither society nor by her husband. While Brihaspati was looked down upon both for the act and for refusing to take care of the child. But the child luckily found a very loving home with his maternal grandparents, and he became a very famous sage, Rishi Bharadwaj, and he and his descendants actually composed the one entire book of the Rig Veda. Now Rig Veda has 10 books and 6 of them are called family books. And each of those family books is composed by members of the same family. So there is one book, I think book 6, which is entirely composed by Rishi Bharadwaj and his descendants. So I've mentioned earlier that it was a great honor to have your hymns included in the Rig Veda. Now imagine if you're allowed to write an entire book, you and your descendants, then that means you've attained a position of very high respect in society. So the point is, Bharadwaj was able to attain that position, and nobody even said that okay, but he was born as a result of a rape. Okay, so that did not matter. Okay. Then one more example I'll quote is from the Ramayana. So this is about an Ikshvaku dynasty prince named Danda. Now unfortunately Danda was a serial rapist, and his father, who was the king, decided to exile him to Dandakaranya. Okay, and the father's reasoning was at least women in this kingdom will be safe from him, and the Dandakaranya is known to be very sparsely populated, so probably he can't cause much damage over there. But unfortunately, Danda met a woman named Abja in Dandakaranya, and she was the daughter of Shukracharya. So Danda raped Abja, and Shukracharya came to know. So he was absolutely furious, and he immediately cursed Danda, causing Danda and his entire clan to perish. And meanwhile, Abja gave birth to a child named Harith. And when the regent in Ayodhya, which was the Ikshvaku capital, when he came to know, he came and escorted Abja and Harith to Ayodhya. And Abja became the queen, and when Harith grew older, he became the king. So again, we see that illegitimacy of being born as a result of a rape did not have any negative impact on the child's future. And even Abja lived a life of respect. She was the queen mother.
So we see that healing and the traumatic response from society was not as we see today, wherein women are sidelined totally. They live in isolation, or very rarely that women come up in telling that no, a harassment or injustice has been committed on me, and then the court had to intervene for protection and all. We see all those things, but we see that in ancient India, such happenings, they were not met with such traumatic responses. That's something which is a different thing which we come across. And what can the story of Usha's and her recovery with community support teach us about psychological healing frameworks?
Okay, so I think, because she felt very humiliated initially, and she felt that ashamed, so she thought I have to hide myself, and this is something which victims go through. Okay, so then what they need is they need their morale to be uplifted by other people. Okay, so yeah, it was exactly as you describe. It was community healing, because you see all these people, they get together and they don't even invade her privacy. Like they could have gone into the cave. They don't do that. They say we are going to wait until she feels better and until she feels ready to come out. But what they are doing is, because they are praising her, they are showing her that her worth is not tied to this incident which happened to her. So I think that is the key psychological element in this. Okay, first she feels that she is still very valued, very highly valued, and her self-worth is not tied to this kind of incident. It's just something very unfortunate which happened to her, but it's also not her responsibility.
Okay. So ma'am, so many new perspectives were spoken today from you. But at the end of the day, a question comes like, why is it that the West, it overlooks so many aspects of these? It's not like they don't have the translation. It's not like they don't have access to the ancient texts of India. There are literary evidences, archaeological evidences. But still, at the end of the day, the West says that, the Eastern civilizations are far more inferior than what the West boasts itself of. Are they trying to hush up or whitewash their own crimes committed on the Indian society? Or are they trying to portray what is not about them? Or are they trying to undermine their own achievement and trying to portray themselves as superior and trying to sideline what was superior and what could be the way forward for the entire civilization of the globe?
So I think there were several reasons. So one reason, so if we are talking specifically about the British, one reason would be that they wanted to justify intervening in India on a larger scale. And for that, what they needed to say is, they needed to say that this civilization is much inferior to our own civilization. Okay, otherwise they don't have any moral right to rule over us. And to keep certain members of the public back home in Britain happy, they actually had to convince them that we have a moral right. Okay, so that's one reason why they downplayed everything. And another reason could have been that they also had a lot of difficulty themselves in believing that the society, especially in ancient times, could have been so different from their own society. Okay, so like I mentioned, how Witzel had difficulty in believing that women could have contributed to the Rig Veda. And a third thing might have been that they genuinely, when they came, society had already changed somewhat, because even before them we were facing invasions, so we had become already little more conservative than the society which I have portrayed. Okay, and then this also links us to some stereotypes about women in our country in past times. And these stereotypes are not just held by foreigners, but also by educated Indians today. For example, we think that women were very meek and submissive, and that it's only recently that they've become assertive. So this is absolutely untrue. Like, if you read the Rig Veda, you will find characters who are very spirited. So I'll just give you an example of two of them. So one is Mudgala's wife. So there is a hymn in the Rig Veda 10.102. This is about Mudgal and his wife. So Mudgal was a Rajarshi.
Yeah.
He belonged to a royal family, but he chose to live as a rishi. So he and his wife lived in an ashram with a lot of cows. Now in the beginning of the hymn, both of them are in trouble because some robbers have come and they have taken away all of their cows. Okay, so the couple is just left with one very old bull and one creaky, broken down wooden cart with one wheel missing. Okay, so then the situation seems hopeless. But Mudgala makes some ad hoc repairs to that cart, and then his wife harnesses that old bull to this repaired cart and she starts driving it. And Mudgal is sitting inside the cart with a bow and arrow. So the wife is a very skilled driver and she guides the cart and she goes after the robbers, and then she keeps navigating it. Mudgal keeps shooting arrows. So they work very well together as a team, and not only do they recover all of their own cows, they also get hold of all of the robbers' cows. So they come back very much richer than when they started. Okay, then there's this other character called Vishpala, who is a woman warrior. She is mentioned in many Rig Vedic hymns, including 1.16. Now, Vishpala actually loses a leg while fighting, so her leg gets cut off. But even that doesn't scare her. So she goes back, she gets an iron leg made. So this is a limb replacement. And then she comes back with that iron leg and she again starts fighting.
Yeah, I heard about that story. That's really a very, very high-ended motivating story.
Yes.
So ma'am, we see that, in spite of having all these evidences that has been transcended to us from so many generations and still lives among us as inspiring case studies, inspiring, examples of women empowerment, why do we as Indians always look to the West for empowering ourselves?
Yeah, so I think that's, you mentioned...
What is the need to do that?
Yeah, so there's absolutely no need to do that. But we don't know, first of all, we don't know enough about our own ancient heritage. So once we come to know about this, then this will raise our self-confidence in ourselves as a nation. And one reason why we might be looking to the West is because of the English Education Act, which you just talked about some time ago, wherein you see the English had shut down all of our schools and we no longer had any access to traditional education. And in addition, they had banned the printing of Sanskrit books. So we could not even access these texts. So now it's changed because now everything is digitized. But back then we did not have access to those texts. So we never even realized that we have this type of heritage. And the British who were educating us at that time in English education, they were continuously telling us that you guys didn't know anything. We are the only ones who know things worth knowing. And they were teaching us those things. So we began to believe them.
We are being stamped as a patriarchal society. But the truth is that we were originally a matriarchal society, wherein women had a role in social upliftment, we had a role in the intellectual capabilities, etc., etc. But we are thrown upon some examples, like some quote Kamasutra as a treatise, some quote Arthashastra as a treatise, some quote several other treatises to show that we have this patriarchy versus matriarchal mindset. What are your comments on these?
Okay, so the Kamasutra and the Arthashastra were both very important texts because they give us a view of what society was like. So the Arthashastra, as you know, was written by Janaka, and because we know the date of Chandragupta Maurya from Alexander's invasion, it was around 326 BC, and that's also only a few years after that Chandragupta became the king. So we can date the Arthashastra to between 300 and 400 BC. And as for the Kamasutra, it was written by Vatsyayan between the 2nd century BC and the 2nd century AD. And a lot of people think that Kamasutra is just a manual, but it's a lot more than that. Okay.
It's about homemaking. It's about
a lot of things in society. So a lot of advice is given to both genders. So one of the things Vatsyayan says in Kamasutra is that he is very strongly discouraging both of marital rape and what we would today call date rape, okay, where somebody you know is the perpetrator. So he condemns both of these, and the reason he gives is that if you try to force a woman, then she's going to be very deeply traumatized and she will actually end up hating men for the rest of her life. So, this is quite a liberal attitude when you consider that there's also an ongoing debate about marital rape even now, right? So, it's, I think, not you can complain against it under domestic violence laws, but there is no separate, you can't include it under the law for rape. Okay, so, then the Arthashastra and the Kamasutra as well, they give a lot of options to women who are experiencing domestic violence in a marriage because they give them exit options since both of them allow divorce. For example, Arthashastra has a number of clauses under which a woman can get a unilateral divorce. That means she doesn't require her husband's permission. For example, one is if he turns out to be of bad character. Now, bad character definitely includes violence and cruelty. Okay, then there were some other situations where she could do this. For example, if he is absent for a long time without informing her, and some other situations also. And very interestingly, Arthashastra also allows for mutual consent divorce because they recognize that sometimes the husband and the wife may just not like each other. They may be always quarreling. And this sort of divorce is called Paraspara Dveshat Moksha, which means freedom from mutual enmity. Okay, then they also allow for widow remarriage as well as remarriage in general. So if you get divorced, you can also get remarried. And the reason we know this is in the Arthashastra, they discuss inheritance laws and they discuss very complicated situations. For example, if a woman has children from her first marriage, how much right do those children have over her second husband's property? Okay, now in case remarriage was actually not happening, why do you need such a law? Why do you need to even frame such a law? So that shows that women were actually getting remarried, whether it's a widow or, whether it's somebody who got divorced. And the Kamasutra also, they talk about widow remarriage. So Vatsyayan says that I think a widow should be free to remarry anyone she likes and that she thinks will suit her. So that's also important, because sometimes when we read about widow remarriage, we think that maybe the first husband's family would have full control over this. For example, there can be a situation where a woman brings some property into her first marriage, but then the husband dies, and then the in-laws don't want to lose control of that property, so they might say, marry another son of ours. Okay, but Vatsyayan is saying, no, this is not the main thing. The main thing is she should be free to choose whom she wants to remarry.
So it's Vedic matriarchy versus modern feminism. Where do we stand in between, and what are your views? Like, we should have a blend of both, or we should try to relook into what we were, or how are we shifting from what was originally validated amongst us, and how are we shifting towards the feminism in after postmodernity? What are your views on this?
Okay, so I would not use the term matriarchy for Vedic society. I would rather say there was a lot of openness and gender equality.
Okay.
Okay, so in fact, one thing I haven't mentioned is there were also many types of marriages. So maybe I won't have time to go into that today. But there's a lot of evidence that there was equality on both sides. So I wouldn't say exactly matriarchal, because matriarchal would imply that men were not powerful. Well, the applications to modern day feminism, well, I would say that, feminism, when it aims towards gender equality, is really important. So that aspect should be maintained, but sometimes feminists and people in general, they think that we have always suffered from gender discrimination. So, we need to also look back at our past, and we need to realize that that was not so. So whatever seems good to us now from the things that we had in the past, we can try and adopt them now, right? And I'm not saying that we blindly adopt everything, because in case we find something which we just think won't go with modern society, then we won't be able to adopt that. Yeah. Okay, but we should selectively adopt some very good things. And it also, I think it's inspiring for a lot of women to see that women's education was valued so much even back in ancient times. So it kind of gives them encouragement if, let's say, they want to pursue their education.
So ma'am, in what ways can revisiting these ancient texts and treatises be helpful to us in the modern sense or in the futuristic sense? Like, we talk about sustainability aspect, we talk about gender equality, equity, we talk about equal opportunities in today's times. So how is it that revisiting all these things that happened in the past would be helpful for women and also men?
What are your thoughts on this?
No, I think, ma'am, we need to have a balanced approach. What was good from the past, if practically possible, they need to be implemented. They can be adopted in the modern sense. And if there's anything that is important from the modern perspective also, I think we need to imbibe it. So these are my views.
Yeah, I also agree with that because, as I said, there are so many inspiring things if we look back at the past, because you see, it's great to strive for gender equality, but sometimes when we do so, we are carrying a burden, because what we think is that we are a society which has always been unjust against women, and then we feel we are starting with a disadvantage. But if we revisit this, then we realize, no, that's not the case. It's just that temporarily some things got distorted. But in fact, we have a great tradition and we can draw inspiration from that.
Thank you very much for your time. Again, Dr. Brishti.
Thank you.
Namaste.
Namaste.